Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk briefly about ecological succession. Now, when you think about succession, my guess is you're probably thinking about somebody succeeding to the throne and taking over. But in environmental science, that's not the type of succession we're looking at. I mean, yes, plants are kind of slowly taking over, but it's a little different than taking over ruling a country. The official definition of ecological succession is the natural gradual changes in the types of species that live in an area, and it can be either primary or secondary. Essentially, as time progresses, the things that you find in one particular location is going to change. Now, this progression of time is pretty long term. We're looking at hundreds, if not thousands of years. And also keep in mind, throughout each stage of ecological succession, you're going to have changes in the total biomass that is found there, also the species richness, and the net primary productivity are all going to change throughout each stage of ecological succession. Primary succession is a process that begins when there is absolutely no soil available. So this would be bare exposed rock. Think about the side of a volcano, particularly after a recent eruption. That is just hard, solid volcanic rock. There is nothing growing off of there. So primary succession really begins when you have the airborne arrival of spores of the true pioneer species. Now, these would be things like lichens. If you look at this picture here, the orange and the white splotches that are attached to the rock, those are lichens. Now, over time, you start with bare rock, and that bare rock is colonized initially by these pioneer species such as lichens. And after a little bit more time, you'll start to get some mosses growing on there. And what happens is these pioneer species, once they die and decay, that organic matter is left behind directly on that spot, and that becomes the soil for later stage succession. So after you start to get a little bit of soil building up, then you will begin to see some grasses colonizing that location. And then as those grasses continue to grow and die and decompose and more grasses grow, that soil layer keeps building up thicker and thicker. And once it's a decent depth, you can start seeing some shrubs growing in there. And as the soil becomes even thicker, then you'll start to see trees. A pioneer species is also called an early successional species, and that's because it takes place in the early stages of succession. And these often have some special adaptations that'll allow them to survive in these harsh conditions, because it's not easy living stuck to the side of a rock. That's just not your typical habitat for a plant. Also, depending on the environment that the lichen is growing on or the different sets of conditions that are happening there, some mutations might be more beneficial than others. So that could lead to the origin of a new species. Now, this is not common. Typically, a rock exposed to sunlight and heat and wind and water and all of that is pretty similar to a rock somewhere else exposed to those same conditions. Now, in the very rare instance that there's some other factor at play, then you might be able to see a new species arise or just a new subspecies. So maybe it'll still be the same type of lichen, it'll just be a slightly different color or a slightly different texture, but genetically they are the same species. Secondary succession is very similar to primary succession. However, the biggest difference is that secondary succession starts with soil. So it begins in a place that has soil that was once home to a diverse habitat and home of living organisms. Because it already starts with a layer of soil, secondary succession takes place much faster than primary succession. And a good example of this would be after a forest fire moves through an area and wipes out all of the trees. So if we look at this diagram of secondary succession, you have the wildfire, and then over time that wipes out all the trees. You start with kind of bare soil. Then pioneer species come in, they start to colonize that area, start to bring a little bit of life back in, And then again, over time, you slowly start to get more of the woody vegetation. But at the end of this, and the same as at the end of primary succession, you end with what's called a climax community. A climax community is just this stable group of plants and animals that doesn't really change much more after it reaches this particular point. Now, some scientists argue that succession is really a cyclical process. So once you reach your climax community, there is going to be some kind of disturbance that reverts you back to primary or secondary succession, depending on what that disturbance is. I also want to make a note here that a climax community is not always big trees. If you are in a desert biome, you are not going to ever get these big trees in forested areas. It's just not possible. Instead, that climax community is going to look a little different. Same with a grassland or a coral reef. They can still reach climax communities, but they're just going to look a little different than a forest climax community. Another type of species that you should be familiar with, in addition to pioneer species, is the indicator species. So indicator species give this early warning signal about any type of danger or threat to a particular ecosystem. You might have heard of a canary in a coal mine. So what would happen is coal miners would take small songbirds in a little cage into the mine with them. Now, these birds were much more sensitive to changes in air pollution than the miners were. So if that bird died or if that bird started showing signs of distress, that was a signal to the miners that it was time to get out of the mine because the air was not good to breathe. Another common indicator species would be amphibians, and that is because they spend part of their life cycle on land and in water. Also, amphibians tend to absorb pollutants and liquids through their skin, and their skin is particularly sensitive to these toxins. So if you start to see significant changes in the amphibian population, you know that there is some big issue going on. That is part of what led Rachel Carson to write the book Silent Spring, because she noticed these changes in amphibian populations and in bird populations. Another category of species that you should know about, and I'm guessing this might be a bit of a review for you, is the term keystone species. So a keystone species has a disproportionately large impact on the environment relative to the number of individuals of that species. So think about a species that helps with pollination of a huge amount of plants. Or maybe a species that is a top predator that helps to control the populations of its prey species pretty significantly. Now, a keystone species is not typically a very large population of individuals. Oftentimes, it's a small population that has a very large impact on the ecosystem. So if you think about a sea otter, they eat sea urchins, and sea urchins normally eat kelp plants. So by having the sea otter population being healthy, it is controlling the sea urchin population, which allows the kelp forest to stay healthy. Another very common example would be the beaver. So beavers build dams that divert waterways and create these large ponding areas, and this actually is an ecosystem engineer. So it changes the landscape based off of the behavior of a small family of beavers. Now again, a whole bunch of information. So remember, there were two types of succession, primary and secondary. The biggest difference between them is that primary succession starts with bare rocks, whereas secondary succession starts with soil. And again, succession usually progresses through stages from smallest types of plants up to larger types of plants and results in a climax community. Remember, climax community does not necessarily mean big trees. And two types of species that you should be familiar with, in addition to pioneer species, is the indicator species, which gives you information about the health or quality of that ecosystem, and the keystone species, which are groups of types of species that have a disproportionately large impact on the environment relative to the number of individuals in that species. Again, this was a lot of information. Please send me your questions, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.